Shalom, everyone. This is the first session of our discussion. It's going to be a seminary on Sephardic pride and heritage. And this is going to be a little more informal. My point is not to start teaching texts and give scholarly just academic lectures, but more to explore the history and tradition of the Sephardic world. And I also want to say that I'm going to talk a little bit of my own history. I want to say that I'm not going to talk much about discrimination. I've experienced a lot of discrimination from non-Sephardic Jews around the world, but there's no point in focusing on that. It's not very helpful. It could cause us to feel frustrated, and we should acknowledge that it's out there. We should treat it as a problem that stems from ignorance, from lack of understanding, but also as a unfortunate natural tendency of mankind to connect to people who are exactly like us and reject people who are not exactly like us. And that happens in every society, even in my very own family. When I got married, my wife is half Moroccan, half Tunisian. Her father is from Tunisia, her mother is from Morocco. And my parents were both born in Baghdad, even though my mother came to Israel when she was 3 weeks old, was brought to Israel. She didn't come on her own, obviously, when she was 3 weeks old. However, when I was dating, my parents issued a very strong warning: never marry a Moroccan girl. And my wife's parents told her to never marry an Iraqi Jew. And we ended up marrying each other. So obviously we're a bit of rebels, but it was just interesting to think how, even, within the Sephardic world, you have that. And the truth is, I know that even within the Iraqi community and the Moroccan community, there are differences and distinctions between the different cities. They will say, oh, he's an Iraqi Jew, but he's not from Baghdad, he's from Mosul or from Basra. And then Moroccan Jews, they say, oh, this guy's from Rabat, from Casablanca, from Marrakesh, etc. So I'm going to start just to tell you a little bit about myself in that context, in that history. So I was born in Yerushalayim to a family that you could say sort of a classic Sephardic family, in the sense of having a long tradition in the Middle East. My great grandfather, I think probably 10 generations back, Rabbi Reuven David Nawi, was born in Damascus, but then migrated to Iraq in the 17th century. And then from then till now, to my great-grandfather, about 10 generations of rabbis and scholars and community leaders. So they had a mixture of the Syrian and Iraqi tradition, but really it's something that belonged to the whole continuum of the Middle East, and definitely under the rule of the Ottoman Empire. And I was born in Yerushalayim, in a very diverse neighborhood with Ashkenazi Jews, Hasidic Jews, secular Jews, people from all over the world, a lot of immigrants, a lot of Holocaust survivors. I went to a school which was called an integrated school, meaning that it brought in kids from all neighborhoods of Yerushalayim, and was also experimental. So I was lucky to get very good education there up until 6th grade, and also have the education of my grandfather. So it was for me, when I think of my conversations with other scholars who think about Sephardic identity, I think that's part of what allowed me to have a certain perspective on the way things are. I'm saying that because there's a trend among Sephardic scholars to emphasize the negativity, the discrimination, especially what happened in the state of Israel during the early years from the 1950s on. And some of them, you could even say, became anti-Zionist or anti-Israel because of that, because they felt that they were so left out of the equation. Then there are others who I also know, some of my friends, my colleagues, who studied in Israel in Ashkenazi institutions and have completely erased their Sephardic identity, almost, you could say, in a way of someone who was oppressed and conquered, because they felt always that they are inferior, that their culture is inferior to the ruling Ashkenazi culture. So they wanted to blend in, they wanted to assimilate. So they would not use their native tongue, whether it was Arabic or Persian or Kurdish. They would not use their names that were given in their traditional language. And actually here, the state also helped, because the state insisted on changing people's names from Fuad to Gidon, from Fuad to Oded, from Fuad to Giora. This is actually people that I met in LA, 4 of my congregants that all had very modern or militant Zionist names: Yoshua, Giora, Oded, and Amos, and Yoel, I think maybe one of them. And I asked them, what was your Arabic name? It was Fuad, 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 which Fuad in Arabic means a heart or a lion. And for them, it was a very significant name in Arabic, but it was taken away from them and another name was given. So for a lot of these people that grew up with that sense of that the Sephardic culture is inferior and Ashkenazi culture is superior, they were embarrassed to admit that they have Sephardic remnants. They tried to erase their accent. They didn't want people to hear they saying het and ayin the way I speak. They didn't want people to know that their parents speak Arabic at home. They were embarrassed to admit that they listen to a different type of music. And obviously, they were not aware of the great wealth of the Sephardic culture. So those are 2 extremes. One extreme are the people who emphasize the Sephardic culture to an extent that they want to reject anything else. And then there are people who completely eradicate their Sephardic tradition. So like I said, luckily I didn't have that, because the school I went to was like I said, an integrated school, not in the sense of Sephardic and Ashkenazi, but having children from all neighborhoods of Yerushalayim, but also the teachers were of all origins and very open-minded in bringing in different traditions, different aspects, but mainly because my grandfather, who was a scholar himself, instilled in us a very strong sense of pride in what we have. In my house, there was never a feeling of my culture is not as important or rich or deep as that of the Ashkenazi culture that sort of controlled Israel at the time. And I knew of the great poets, scientists, scholars, philosophers, the history of the Sephardic world, and I was very proud of that. Then, after high school, after my grandfather passed away, I got drawn, or pushed rather, into the ultra-Orthodox Haredi world. I was in yeshiva for 6 years, yeshiva and kollel, but eventually I ended up following my grandfather's advice, and that's part of the Sephardic world, who said that the purpose of learning Torah is to eventually use it in a practical way in the world and help others. In the Sephardic world, a Torah scholar cannot be isolated in an ivory tower. He has to be involved with the people. So with that guidance from my grandfather, who already passed away, I went to work as a teacher and a cantor in Bogota, Colombia. So I learned the Spanish. I got to know the community in South America. I met people from Venezuela, Panama. Then I went back to Israel, and then I got back to the United States and worked with people from the Syrian community. And that is something interesting that I found out. In Bogota, all Sephardic people were called Turcos, like people from Turkey. In Brooklyn, all Sephardic communities are called Syrian because the majority is Syrian, so everybody blends into the Syrian. Then I moved to LA, and in LA, people knew the differences, but when I spoke to someone who was not Sephardic, and I would say, I'm Sephardic, he would say, oh, so you're Persian, because for them, all Sephardim were Persian. So that's taught me that there is a great deal of ignorance on behalf of the non-Sephardic world, where they put everything, into the same, for them, into the same bucket, into the same pile. And it's important for us to know the differences within ourselves, to know our narrative, to know our history. And as you know, for the last 7 or 10 years I've been teaching online, I'm really trying to bring back that sense of Sephardic pride, which I think helps us reestablish our tradition and our heritage. And also to create this very strong sense of identity. And now we will talk, and I'm open to questions or comments. I want to talk about what Sephardic tradition means. Because when I ask people, what is special about being Sephardic? The answer that always comes back, like almost inevitably, would be Sephardim have better food and better music, which I agree with 100%. There's no argument that our food is better, our music is better. But that's only one aspect of our culture. The full culture carries much more than that. One of the main differences when you think of the difference between the Sephardic world and the Ashkenazi world is that the Sephardic world is much more traditional in its connection to Torah and mitzvot. And in the Ashkenazi world, it's an either or. Either you're observant or you're not. There's no such thing as going to watch a soccer game on Shabbat after coming back from shul. If you went to the synagogue in the morning and you did kiddush, you stay home all day. And there's no such thing. And in the Sephardic world, it exists. So a lot of people in the observant world look at this negatively. They say this is hypocrisy. Either you are or you're not. But from within the perspective of the Sephardic world, I could tell you that this is something that maintained us in a much more wholesome way, because people were not pushed out. People were always part of the tradition. In one of my talks on YouTube, that I discussed the question of why there are no reform or conservative movement among Sephardic Jews. And I'll just say here, briefly, the message of that class, of that discussion. A lot of people, including scholars, including people from academia, say or think that the reason there's no reform among the Sephardim is that the Sephardic Jews were not exposed to the European culture during the Emancipation and then the Enlightenment. And because they did not have to deal with it, they never split into reform or conservative. And I think that the answer is exactly the opposite. Sephardic Jews did not splinter into those sub-movements because they were already exposed to and they already encountered the science and culture of other religions and other cultures, namely the Muslim and the Persian, and later on in Sepharad, they opened up to different to different cultures. And because they were exposed, they were immune. Just like when you think of in the medical world, if you want to protect someone from infection by isolating that person, you put them in a totally sterile room with no exposure to dust or pollen or bacteria or anything like that. That person will be healthy, but only when he is inside this isolated, insulated bubble. The moment he steps out, any little infection can destroy him. So similarly, the Sephardic world was always exposed and interacted with the world around it, whereas the Ashkenazi world was shut down in a spiritual, mental ghetto because of historical reasons, because of how the community evolved. We speak about that. And therefore, when they were exposed to the emancipation, to enlightenment, to different cultures, they had nothing to defend themselves with. And that's how the community split. And also, one of the elements there was that the rabbis were unyielding. The rabbis, the only way the rabbis knew to protect their community was to shut the community, to close it inside a bubble. So when people would come and tell the rabbi, we want to do something a little differently, I said, no, it's not, you can't do it, it's heresy. When they insisted, they were kicked out. So if someone said, for example, I can't go with kippah the whole day, you're a heretic, get out of the camp. If someone said, I want to hear the drasha in German, I don't understand your Yiddish or your Hebrew, I want to hear drasha in German, the sermon, was kicked out. If someone said, I want to shave my beard or to wear shorter clothes, European clothes, out. So after a while, and it's a very simplistic way of putting it, there were enough outcasts outside the wall to form a new movement, which became the Reform movement, because they were all pushed out. Whereas in the Sephardic world, there was a room for this flexibility. And we'll talk about it in the future. But I just bring it now, a point that I think is important. In the early times of Islam, which is, in my opinion, it's important to study the origin and development of Islam and to be able to understand that Islam today is not what it was 1,000 years ago or 1,300 years ago. Today, unfortunately, most people identify Islam with the extreme fanaticists of Islam. Islam is much greater than that, and the unique nature of the Sephardic world has a lot to do with the influence that we received from Islam in the early centuries. So one of the guiding principles of Islam in the beginning was the principle of zandaqa, which means heresy. The Islamic scholars actually encourage heresy. They encourage people to ask tough questions. There was almost like a competition of who could come up with tougher questions. So they encouraged free thinking, analysis, challenging your beliefs in order to find out what the truth is. Meanwhile, what typified the Christian world was dogma. Those are the principles. You have to follow them. You cannot deviate to the right and to the left. But okay, that was just a general review. I want to go, sort of roll back to the idea, which for me is in the core of our discussion here. And that is the idea, like I said, the sense of pride of knowing our narrative. And this is based on an incident that happened to me when we came back as a family from Colombia to Israel. So when I left Israel to go to Colombia, my oldest son was 4 years old. He went to school there for 5 years, 3 years, 2 years in a Jewish school and 3 years in an American school. Because as a gifted child, it didn't fit the system in the Hebrew school. But he was always very proud of his tradition. And as part of the Sephardic community, he was identified by others as Turco. He knew there were Turcos and Polacos, Turkish Jews and Polish Jews. That was like the general term. But he never experienced any incident of discrimination. Nobody came and told my son when he lived in Colombia, oh, you are Turquino, you are a Turco, you're less than who I am. We all lived in peace and harmony, everything was great. Then we came to Israel, and I enrolled him in a school in Petah Tikva called Dachen Noam. And he came home, I think the first or second week, and he was very, very, very distraught, very stressed out. I said, what happened, Ariel? What's the matter? And he told me he was in fifth grade. He told me that the kids tease him and they tell him, oh, it's Sephardi, you're Sephardic, like they were mocking him for being Sephardic. He never experienced anything like that. And he did not know what to do. So what do you do in a case like that? What do you tell your kid? Is, your child is in school, they're being mocked for being Sephardic. What are you going to tell him? Be like them, blend in, tell them I'm Ashkenazi. What are you going to do? So what I did was that, since it was a religious school, I gave my son a list of the great Sephardic scholars. I said, here's a list, memorize it, right? The next time someone tells you you're Sephardic, tell him, yes, I'm Sephardic, and so were the Rif, the Rambam, the Ran, the Ramban, the Rabbi Yosef Karo, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, Rabbi Daftaya, who's my great-grandfather, and Rabbi Ben Zion Meir Hai Oziel. If you want to talk to me, first go and study everything they wrote, and then I'll talk to you. So my son did that. Not only did that, he found at home I had a book called Chachmei Bavel, the Scholars of Bavel. And he would take it to school. There's pictures on the cover of all the great rabbis from Bavel, including Hacham Daftaya. And they would sit and read it in school like that, in his free time. And kids would come over and say, what are you reading? Can I see the book? And he would say, are you Sephardic? No. Now, what I did, the purpose in doing that, I wanted him to understand and to be able to convey that not only he is not embarrassed in being Sephardic, he is proud of being Sephardic. And okay.
I'm kidding.
Oh, okay. No, everything was good. He became beloved by everyone. No, those boys who were rejected originally by him, they welcomed him. He opened the club. He told them to pray with Sephardic Havara, and everything was great. But I'm saying, what it did for him is to understand that the pillars of culture, of Jewish culture, are Sephardic. So he's nothing to be embarrassed of. And that is where we should really start. Now we could go and talk about, where Sephardic comes from. So I know there are a lot of misconceptions out there that we have to deal with. Maybe I'll start with this. And then maybe if people have questions, we could present them now, and then we'll deal with them, as we go along. So I just want to say that why am I using the term Sephardic? It's not in a second. So a lot of people ask, and I was asked personally, why do I identify as Sephardic if my family did not go through Sepharad, which is Spain? And my answer to that is, when I say Sephardic, I'm not using it as a geographic marker, because you know very well that if you're a Spanish Jew, and if you were expelled from Spain, even though you were part of what was called back then La Nación, the nation, people from Spain identified by their city. No, nobody said I'm Sephardi. They would say I'm from Navarra, from Aragon, from Castilla. They had specific cities or specific kingdoms that they identify with. When we say Sephardic, we speak about a theology, a philosophy, a way of life that is unique to the Sephardic world in general, which we could say basically is the non-European world. And that up to the 13th century was 97% of world Jewry were Sephardim. This is a culture that grew and evolved in the Middle East. The Sephardic period, when we talk about Sepharad per se, Spain, started in the 8th century with the invasion of the Muslims to Spain, and continued until the expulsion from Spain in 1492. So that already gives you about 800 years. And even before that, there were Jews in Spain. But before the invasions of the Muslim to Spain, already the culture of Sephardic that later on guided the Sephardic world started by the Gaonim of Babylonia. And there was a parallel period of the early years of the Gaonim in Babylonia. The early period of the Gaonim in Babylonia parallels the beginning of Sephardic settlement, Jewish settlement in Spain in an independent way. There were Jews in Spain very early on, but up until the Muslim conquest, they were subjugated by the Visigoths, by the German tribes who controlled Spain, and did not have much freedom of movement or religion. Well, they were freed when the Muslims came in, and for the first 200 years they were still under the direction of the Geonim from Spain. Then, from Bavel, and then they started developing their own tradition. But we could say very confidently that the Spanish culture, the Sephardic culture of Sepharad of Spain, is a continuation of the Torah of the Geonim that started already in the 6th century. So we have almost more than 1,000 years of this continued tradition that later on spilled into the rest of the world with the expulsion from Spain. But even before that, was present there through the teachings of the Geonim. So when I say Sephardic, I am referring to this theology. If someone asks me, how do I identify myself as a Jew? I'm a Jew, I'm Israeli, I'm Sephardic. If they ask me, where are you from ethnically? My parents are from Iraq, and their parents are, going back, are from Syria. But theologically, philosophically, I'm Sephardic. Nathaniel, you had a question, comment?
You kind of touched on it a lot. My question in a nutshell is for somebody like myself and others who don't have the family connection, but identify with the philosophy, but kind of have a little bit of maybe like not imposter syndrome, but something a little more mild than that. It's like when I talk about my family, which I love, and I attribute converting to Judaism to my mom and dad. But when I talk about them, it's like, oh, my mom's from Hawaii and my dad's from the Bahamas. There's no Sephardi heritage in my family, for one. And just a quick example of how this plays out. I was sitting at a Shabbat table with an Ashkenazi family, and I was telling them about my old roommate before I met Amanda, my roommate was Israeli, and he's still my friend, and I'm actually going to his wedding next month. And so his name's Amihai, and they spell it with an H. They don't spell it with a CH because I'm pretty sure his family's Iraqi or maybe even Moroccan. Mm-hmm. So I was talking about him, and they were correcting me at the table in front of Amanda. It's Chai, Amichai. And I was like, but that's not how he spells his name. That's not how he pronounces his name. And it's like, you have this constant, and if I try to push back and say, no, I'm Sephardi, they'd be like, what are you talking about? You're a convert. So it's like, how do people like me, strongly connect to it without being kind of self-centered to say, well, my rabbi is Iraqi or my nusach is Sephardi. It's like,
So I think that actually what I said answers that. In terms of pronunciation, you have to separate the two things. You could tell them in terms of pronunciation, you could tell them I'm a linguist and I did the research and I think that this is the right way to pronounce it. And we have proofs for that. The argument there would not be I'm Sephardic and that's why I pronounce the words like that, but rather that the Sephardic tradition is more accurate and I choose to follow it when it comes to pronunciation, because the Hebrew language is an economic language and there are no two letters which sound the same. And if you remind me, I'll send you my recording on that, exactly how to pronounce each letter.
I just listened a couple of weeks ago.
Okay.
I think
but that's only one. That's only half of it. The other half, which is more important, is your identity, right? So anyone who became a Jew by choice already adopted a new identity, right? That of being Jewish. So when I say that Sephardic is a philosophical identity within Judaism, you could be Sephardic. Any Ashkenazi-born Jew can be Sephardic. It has nothing to do with your DNA. It has to do with your philosophy. So everybody's welcome to be Sephardic. When I hear people tell me the rabbi who converted me told me I must follow his minhagim, I said, where did he take it from? You're allowed to take any minhag that you want, Ashkenazi or Sephardic, whichever you want. The rabbi does not make you into a Jew. The rabbi only helps you, facilitates the process for you. You're the one who chooses that. So, but here we have to say also something about conversions and about Jewish DNA that maybe not everybody will be happy to hear, but it's the truth, so we have to say it. Jews, wherever Jews went, they assimilated. They married local families. In some cases, those local families became Jewish. In some cases, the Jews assimilated into the local families, but later on came back to Judaism after a generation or two or three. In some cases, it was deliberate. Jews who came as immigrants to a new place, small families, they needed people to marry with. They knew that you can't be inbred for too long, or they simply ran out of people. So what they did was they would hire people, or in some cases, when it was still allowed and practiced, which obviously should not be, slavery was practiced. They would purchase slaves, non-Jewish slaves, and educate them in the ways of Judaism, and that also allowed them to observe whether this person is fit to become a Jew or not. So it's a little crazy for us to think today that 1,000 years ago maybe the way into Judaism was through slavery, but that was the case. And there's two communities where we know specifically that was done. One is the Portuguese colony in Goa, near India. The few Portuguese Jews who got there didn't have much choice, who to marry. So they taught and converted the local community, and they became the basis for some of the Jewish communities in India. But before that, maybe the most significant process was that of the first Italian Jews who migrated to Germany and became the basis for the Ashkenazi community, because they came there and they were four families, and after a while they didn't have enough people to marry. So they would purchase slaves who were brought to Germany after military campaigns. Those slaves were mostly of Eastern Europe. And that's why, the Slavic people are called Slavs. It was a derogatory term. It meant slaves. And so, and Jews would acquire those slaves and train them, men and women, and afterwards they would marry them. And when they got married, they became full members of the Jewish community. They didn't have that slave status. They basically redeemed them. But that stopped when the church issued decrees against it. It became a very dangerous act. To convert a Christian to Judaism became an offense, a capital offense. If you did that, you could face execution. So people obviously avoided doing that. One of the proofs that we have for that, other than some halachic discussions of the status of someone who converts to Judaism, is an early dispute between a Jew and a non-Jew in Germany in the 9th century, where the rabbi writes the arguments of the non-Jews against the Jews. And he says one of the ways that the non-Jews mock us is by telling us that we are dark people with black eyes and black hair. But you read that and you think, wait a second, in most of the Ashkenazi world today, people pride themselves for me, like the first difference that we'll tell between Ashkenazim and Sephardim is fair skin and blonde hair or blue eyes. Like, my mother-in-law is from Marrakesh. She has fair skin and blue eyes and blonde hair. My daughter had blonde hair when she was born. I had a granddaughter with blonde hair and blue eyes. And everyone says, well, are you sure she's Sephardic? Like, that's the automatic marker, Sephardic Ashkenazi. And then if you really look closely, there are a lot of Ashkenazi Jews who have dark complexion, dark hair. There's a mix there. So obviously there was assimilation everywhere. And whoever we have today practicing Judaism is a product of that. For some reason, Judaism remained in that family. Could be that the whole family started by a group of people who were not Jewish originally, but converted to Judaism. And that also brings me to talk about the 23andMe, all kind of DNA testings. A lot of my friends and neighbors here in Potomac, are Ashkenazi Jews, and a lot of them are educated people who decided to take because of the DNA test to see, where they come from, and they come by and say, I'm 60% Ashkenazi, all right, 70% Ashkenazi, whatever, etc., etc. I said, what is the Ashkenazi DNA? Where does it come from? When you say that you have Ashkenazi DNA, it means that you are a descendant of the 4 original families who moved from Italy to Germany. And before living in Italy, they moved there from Israel. They were Mediterranean Jews who moved to Italy and then moved to Germany, and then inbred for a long time until they also brought in people from the non-Jewish world. But if you see the dominant markers in their DNA, it's because they come from those 4 families. So they're not, that Ashkenazi Jews means I'm a descendant of a very narrow group within the Sephardic world. Eventually grew up to become more numerous in size. So that's just sort of historical perspective on that. But I still want to go back and start talking about the literature of the Gaonim and what is the unique thing, what are the unique things that they taught us. But I want to conclude with this. There are terms that we use today that are totally wrong. They are misnomers. One of them is Western civilization. When we say Western civilization, what does it mean? The West versus the East, right? The West is Europe, and after Europe, America, and the East is the Middle East and maybe the Far East. I don't know. But
I will say that it's actually even narrow than that. I mean, Western civilization for many people, and is just the Anglo-Saxon world.
Yeah.
Because if you go to Europe and if you go to visit, I don't know, for example, Bulgaria or Greece or even Italy or Spain, the culture is not what you expect from Western culture. Is very Mediterranean. It's very close to even North Africa or the Middle East, to give you an example.
Exactly.
So
I agree
it's
with
just
you.
Anglo-Saxon.
Right. But what people say about Western civilization, really, the right term for Western civilization should be Mediterranean civilization. Because when you think of Christianity as part of that Western civilization, it's a byproduct, or it was born out of Judaism, which was created in the Middle East. Islam was born out of the conjuncture of Judaism and Christianity in the Arabian Peninsula, also the Middle East, now spread around the world. The Renaissance relies on the science and culture of Greece and Rome, which are both Mediterranean countries, like Avraham just said. There's actually a school of geography and anthropology that sees the Mediterranean as a unit by itself. All the shores of the Mediterranean, North Africa, Greece, Spain, France, Italy, as a culture of its own. The leader of that school is Fernand Braudel of France, and the one who continues his direction now is David Abulafia, who's a professor of history in Oxford. Is a book called The Great Sea. So this is one thing that we should really remember, that the term Western civilization, European civilization, the way it is used today is misleading, because a lot of the elements of this culture really were born and created in the Middle East, in the same place that really is the source of Sephardic culture. And we'll talk about this B'ezrat Hashem next time. Eduardo, you have a question, comment? Yes.
Rabbi, some time ago, a professor told me that this terminology was created by the England, and the reference was the India. So the reference between East to West was created by United Kingdom.
Yes.
Evidently was not United Kingdom several centuries ago, but this is the main focus, I think.
Yeah, it's pretty accurate that the Eurocentric approach in the study of mankind in society is pretty much product of the British, like Abraham said, the Anglo-Saxon. This is they're also in maps. If you look at most of the maps of the world, put Europe, Europe and America in the center, and the rest is sort of like pushed to the side.
Can I share a map, please?
Sure.
Adding to what you said, Eduardo, I think the other interesting thing is that India is a mother culture for the Western world as well. And many people don't know that because it's older than many. I think it's the oldest culture in the world, the Indian culture.
India is one of the oldest cultures in the world. In the Indus Valley, in the city of Mohenjo-daro, the remnants of technology, the irrigation system, even some people believe the first battery was found there from thousands of years ago. Also, in terms of language, the language of the Germanic people originated in India, the Indo-Aryan or Indo-European languages.
So
yes,
I would like to share this. This is one presentation. Sorry, it's in Portuguese to explain the Jewish life in my state in Santa Catarina. Everything is in Portuguese here, for pictures of my community and my physical community. But I would like to share this. This picture. Here we have the position of London. Originally, the navigation to India was this way.
Mm-hmm.
This way was created by Vasco da Gama in more or less 500 years ago. The English people discovered this possibility in the Suez Channel. So the distance here is 50% lower than this original distance. And it's much more safety because here is very, very dangerous to navigate. So this concept, through the English perspective, divided the world in Eastern and Western. So
yeah. Thank you, Eduardo. That's important. So I'll just reiterate something that I say in other classes, and I think it's really quintessential to the Sephardic approach, and that is that the study of history is extremely important. No matter what you study, you have to know history. So we cannot talk about Sephardic identity if we only look at the last 150 years or 200 years. We have to go all the way back. When we go to the period of the Geonim, we should go even before that. When is the first presence of Jews in North Africa and Babylonia, etc.? And Bezalel Hashem, we'll do it next week. This was our first session, just introduction of the topic.